2022 that NATO would be fragmenting soon. It's now happening. Why is that, Colonel?
Well, people tend to forget that the NATO alliance, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself, was originally a purely defensive alliance. And its organizing strategic imperative was effectively to prevent the Soviets from ever trying to conquer the rest of Europe. We forget that at the end of the Second World War, which we tout as our great victory, 50% of Europe was in the hands of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So our victory was not by any means complete, and a lot of people didn't even regard it as a true victory because we'd lost half the continent. People began asking why did we do as we did at the time. There are a lot of questions that came up, but the answer was NATO. and you know, I think it worked well as a defensive alliance when it was required, but after 1992, 93, there was no requirement for it, and most Europeans knew that.
NATO was never meant to be permanent. It was a defensive arrangement built for a specific moment in history when half of Europe lay under Soviet control. When that moment passed, the alliance should have been re-examined, if not quietly retired. Instead, it was expanded, repurposed, and transformed into a political instrument. What we're witnessing today is not a failure of unity, but the predictable unraveling of an institution that outlived its mission and mistook endurance for legitimacy.
The best way to look at Europe as an element of importance to the United States from a vanity standpoint is to go back to the Roman Empire. Originally, the Greeks invited the Romans to come in and help them throw out an enemy who was from Macedonia, one of Alexander the Great's descendants. And the Romans agreed to do that. They came in, the Romans threw them out. Then the Greeks began to fight amongst themselves. So the Romans said, enough of that. You're now going to become part of the empire. And under the rules of the empire, you're going to supply us with 2 legions, Greek legions, organized, trained, and equipped exactly like the 2 Roman legions that are currently in Greece. And so the Greeks overnight became part of the Roman Empire. Now, they were not all that unhappy, Judge, as you can imagine, because Greco-Roman culture, there's a reason we call it Greco-Roman, and the Romans revered the Greeks.
This analogy matters because it reveals how power relationships actually evolve. What begins as assistance slowly turns into dependency, and dependency eventually hardens into control. Rome didn't conquer Greece in a single act of violence. It absorbed it through obligation, structure, and authority. Europe's relationship with the United States followed a similar arc after the Second World War. Protection gradually became supervision, partnership turned into alignment, and now, as in Rome's time, the junior partner is beginning to question whether the arrangement still serves its own survival.
Over time, it became something else. It became a very inexpensive ADT. You know, you're familiar with the ADT home alarm system. It's been very successful across the United States. Well, if you want ADT to protect you, you know, you have to pay a bill. They'll send you a bill, they'll install it, and then you pay them on a monthly basis. Well, we installed ADT. It was called the United States Armed Forces, with some supporting or augmenting local European military strength, but we didn't charge anybody anything. And so finally, you know, Trump became president back in 2016. And one of his immediate comments was, well, we're paying all of this money and the Europeans aren't playing their role. Well, I think it's finally come around to the point where, thanks to the Ukraine catastrophe and the failure of the NATO alliance to operate effectively, he said, enough's enough, and we're not going to do it anymore. So if you want ADT, you're going to have to pay up. But we all know that their financial condition is as bad, if not worse, than our own.
The ADT analogy is uncomfortable because it's accurate. Europe outsourced its security, and Washington underwrote the bill without ever sending an invoice. Over time, that arrangement produced dependency rather than deterrence. Militaries atrophied, budgets shrank, and political responsibility evaporated. Now the bill is finally being presented, not just in dollars, but in strategic reality. And the problem isn't that Europe doesn't want to pay, it's that after decades of neglect, it may no longer be able to.
Is who comes to power next, and what are they going to do to save Europe from the ruins? And that's an important question. I can't answer that at this point, but I think that will happen.
But these people are crazy enough to think that they can save Ukraine from the ruins by continuing the war effort that they cannot fund. They can't borrow, they can't tax any more than they've already taxed without being thrown out of office. And thanks to the Belgians' basic understanding of property law, they can't steal the bank accounts.
Well, listen, I think you're right, but I would see it a little differently. I think President Trump has sent the message that we are not going to commit forces. Our role in this process is going to be diminished. I think he's finally come around to understanding that the Russians are going to stick by their basic requirements, which means a neutral Ukraine without any foreign military influence or presence. They're not going to accept another puppet as the leader in Kiev, somebody like Zelensky sitting in London, who's being groomed as the next Zelensky in Kiev by the MI6 and the British government. They'll never accept it. And he's already told them, I'm not going to send any more equipment.
What's being described here is the collision between political fantasy and economic reality. European leaders are attempting to sustain a war they can neither finance nor win, while postponing the harder task of rebuilding their own societies. At the same time, Washington appears to be signaling strategic fatigue, a quiet acknowledgement that Russia's core demands will not change. When power, money, and public consent all run out at once, policy doesn't evolve. It collapses.
Are we sending cash to the most corrupt regime in Europe that is teetering on the brink of collapse?
Well, twofold. First of all, people on the Hill have enriched themselves as a result of this war. Their donors, the industries, the lobbyists, everyone who supports this endeavor has found a way to pay off the politicians. And remember, the same people that are anxious for us to remain in a state of war in perpetuity with, say, Iran or anybody else Israel doesn't like, are the same people who are pushing the war in Russia. And by the way, I think you can identify most of the same players pushing for war in Venezuela.
Yes.
So that's part of the problem. The second part, and this is a wonderful opportunity, by the way, for the President of the United States, though I don't think he's really figured it out yet. And that is to veto the bill, because we can't afford it. We really can't. We are an empire that is on the verge of total bankruptcy.
This is the moment where rhetoric gives way to structure. Wars rarely persist because they are strategically sound. They persist because they become financially embedded. Once conflict turns into a revenue stream for contractors, lobbyists, and political careers, ending it becomes a threat to the system itself. But there is a hard limit to that logic. Empires don't collapse from moral failure alone. They collapse when the money runs out. And by every serious measure, the United States is approaching that threshold.
Take seriously diplomacy conducted by two real estate agents.
I think the Russians are polite, but in principle, the answer is no.
I mean, stated differently, does Marco Rubio, when you said these are the same people that want us supplying Gaza, disrupting Venezuela, fighting in Ukraine, I was going to say, can you spell Rubio? Does Marco Rubio want the Ukraine war to end soon? And does he and do his neocon buddies somehow think that Ukraine can miraculously be saved at this point by some whatever from Europe or the United States?
Well, whatever these people truly believe is a mystery to me. I don't know. I can't answer that. I think they want to sustain what they think is harm to Russia. They refuse to believe that Russia is not being harmed. They refuse to believe that the Russian economy is not suffering. They refuse to believe that Russian losses are, compared with what Ukraine has taken, almost 1.8 million dead at this point in uniform, are minuscule.
Diplomacy only works when it is grounded in realism. The problem in Washington today is not a lack of communication, but a refusal to accept facts that contradict ideology. When policymakers become emotionally invested in an enemy's collapse, evidence no longer matters, losses are denied, economic realities are ignored, and diplomacy is reduced to performance. At that point, negotiations aren't meant to resolve conflict, they're meant to prolong it, and serious powers like Russia recognize the difference immediately.
Going to Geneva to meet with the other foreign ministers of NATO. No, you're not. The Secretary of the Army is going. So what is Rubio doing? He's worried about the font. I'm not making this up. Font sizes on the official documents that come out of State Department.
Well, if what you say is true, I think that's a great focus for Mr. Rubio. The more he focuses on that, the safer I feel. Look, this is something else. This is called late stage empire behavior. You're talking about a government that is confused. The policy making process has broken down. Everybody knows that the lobby owns Congress. Now, does Congress have other interests other than whatever AIPAC tells them to focus on? Of course they do. And there are other lobbies, the pharmaceuticals, we could go down the list. The problem is that everybody on the Hill is bought and paid for. So whenever they do something, they do it under duress or they do it at the direction of their donors.
This is what late-stage imperial dysfunction looks like. Not collapse through invasion, but paralysis through triviality. When institutions lose strategic purpose, they retreat into process, optics, and internal rituals. Power becomes performative, while real decision-making migrates elsewhere to donors, lobbyists, and unelected networks of influence. At that point, policy is no longer designed to solve problems. It exists to maintain appearances. History shows that once governance reaches this stage, reform becomes extremely difficult, and decline accelerates quietly but relentlessly.